So what's our intro format?
What do you mean, what's our intro format? This is it.
Okay.
So, I'm Michael J. Flores, and I'm with the innovator Patrick Chapin, and this is Top Level Podcast.
Yeah, that's true. That's completely true.
So, listeners at home, this is some iteration of this is a project that Patrick and I have been talking about doing for at least 3 or 4 years, and now we're doing it.
There's a lot to be said about Magic and a lot to talk about with it, but at the end of the day, our focus on Top Level Podcast is high-value material, stuff that's actually going to help us win more at tournaments and accomplish more of our Magic goals. Because it's all fun and games just hanging out, shooting the breeze, talking about whatever. But at a certain point, you kind of want to just buckle down and focus on how to actually break the format or how to actually win whatever tournament it is we're preparing for.
So you have a tournament coming up in 2 weeks, right?
Ish.
Ish?
I leave in like a week and a half. Actually, I guess it is 2 weeks. Wow, I better get cracking on breaking that format.
You got 4 formats to play, right? Is that?
Yeah, I already broke 3 of them. Oh, I shouldn't say broke. Already solved 2, broke 1. Have to try ever playing the other one for once in my life.
I won't even ask you which one's which.
Vintage Masters is the one that I have never played before. We're actually going to get. It's kind of exciting. This week, I'm actually getting together, doing some paper Vintage Masters drafts with just real cards. So that's kind of sweet.
Yeah, who are you doing that with?
Hopefully some of the people at Direwolf, see if I can rope Louise in, or Conley, or Michael Jacob, or Brandon. Any of the Direwolf people. Dan Burdick, Matt Place. We got a lot of studs in the game company over there.
So for those,
actually, to be fair, WotC very generously shipped me a bunch of, and all the other competitors as well. They shipped us all 10 draft sets of Vintage Masters to practice, presumably, online.
Direwolf is a gaming company based in Denver, Colorado that Patrick and fellow Hall of Famer Luis Scott Vargas and a bunch of other experienced Magic players work for.
Yeah, we're currently working on a phone app called Tic Tac Toe. So you can look for that. Hopefully, in about 6 or 7 years, it'll be sweet.
Cool.
In the meantime, Standard coming up. There are 4 formats to Worlds, as you mentioned. The other 3 are Cons Booster Draft, which I think is one of the best limited formats of all time. It's absolutely awesome. Standard, which obviously played a lot of that, and looking forward to playing more of it. I think this is a great Standard format. There's a ton of room for play. There's a lot of different ways you can go, and there's a lot of advantage to be gained from tight technical play. And finally, Modern, which is kind of a dicey format. It's kind of, obviously there was just a Modern Grand Prix, but the impact of Dig Through Time, Treasure Cruise, Monastery Swift Spear, Jeskai Ascendancy, more fetch lands. It's going to be, and more. It's going to be interesting seeing what happens with the Modern format coming up. Today, though, I kind of feel like we should just pick one and go with it. So I'm thinking Standard.
So I think that we'll talk about Standard as well. So, and I think kind of the centerpiece of what I wanted to talk about in this one revolves around one of your favorite cards from Khans of Tarkir, which is Siege Rhino.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Siege Rhino is one of the few cards that can make a real claim to being the best card in Standard. Dig Through Time, Courser of Crufix. There's a few different options, but I think Siege Rhino is kind of an absurd Magic card. So
when the set was spoiled, before any of us played it yet, you and I were having a phone conversation about the new cards in Khans of Tarkir, and I was kind of tentatively hey, I think this is my favorite card. It's kind of Value Town-ish, but I don't know. It's kind of really mid-rangey at the time, especially the the green decks in Standard were projected to be all these powerhouse decks based on cards like Genesis Hydra, more ramp, Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx sort of decks, and historically those kind of decks prey upon mid-range-ish green decks. But you're like, no, you had an interesting take on Siege Rhino.
Is that just that Siege Rhino is just the most efficient card in the set?
It's just something like, it's like drawing 3 cards.
Oh, yeah. Siege Rhino, yeah, I mean, and keep in mind, this is just kind of a comical Magic card for anybody who's ever played with Ernem Jin in a tournament setting and been happy about it.
Oh, I had 5. I was one of those humans.
Ernem Jin was a 4/5 for 4 with a drawback. This guy, his drawback, so he's got trample, which is already better. But then to make up for the fact that he has trample, you have to agree to drain your opponent for 3 life. Which I think a lot of people might not fully appreciate just how strong draining your opponent for 3 is. But that's like drawing 2 more cards right there. So this is like a draw 3, where one of the cards is a undercosted creature, and I guess it's like drawing 3 cards, where one of the cards is a creature that's already in play, and the other 2 cards are like, a lava spike to your opponent's face and a healing salve. And you might be saying, "Oh, healing salve's not that good. I wouldn't play with it." Yeah, but I mean, you're literally getting it for 0 mana and without having to pay a card because it's tacked on to 2 other cards.
So if you compare Siege Rhino to some kind of comparable cards that are about
Loxodon Hierarch is one that a lot of people bring up.
Loxodon Hierarch is what I was thinking of. When Loxodon Hierarch was in Standard, it was far and away considered the best creature in Standard. It was like, hey, this guy's a stop sign for beatdown decks. 4/4 for 4 was considered highly efficient. Obviously, Siege Rhino's 4/5 for 4. He only gained 3 life instead of the 4 life on Loxodon Hierarch, but Loxodon Hierarch, he was often chumped by Saproling tokens. Siege Rhino is going to go over the top of those, and like you said, draining someone for 3 is pretty substantial.
Yeah, I mean, Loxodon Hierarch is a lot like a 4/4 for 4 that also draws a card, And the combination of gaining 4 life plus Loxodon Hierarch's Fringe sacrifice ability, and that's great, compared to the other cards of the era. Siege Rhino, though, Siege Rhino is a messed up Magic card. It's like drawing 2 extra cards, and it's a card in itself. I mean, it's a 4/5 Trampler. A 4/5 Trampler for 4 is already better than you normally get. Now, granted, nobody's going to play with Siege Rhino if it didn't have the other ability, just because there's so many other undercosted creatures. But the draining somebody for 3 is so much better than just gaining 4 life. I mean, just think about how much pressure you put on somebody. I mean, I can't think of how many times I've just cast a Siege Rhino on turn 4 and a Siege Rhino on turn 5, and my opponent who's playing a beatdown deck is going to lose the race,
Sure, I had some games like that tonight. So in preparation for recording this podcast with you, I played a bunch of different Abzan decks to acclimate myself to the nuances, and I guess not nuances because it's such a heavy-hitting card of Siege Rhino. So one of the things that I really like about Siege Rhino is you look at the card and it's got black, green, and white mana symbols, and you're like, well, this is a pretty restrictive card. But you can actually play it in, essentially Abzan decks, but a bunch of different kinds of decks, I would say.
Oh, yeah.
There's very aggressive decks where Siege Rhino is kind of like the Fire Blast of the deck. It's the expensive card that comes after Rakshasha Death Dealer, or mid-range-ish decks like Arilax used to win the Pro Tour. The deck I was mostly playing tonight was actually a deck based on Whip of Erebos. And let me tell you, you know what's better than 4 Siege Rhinos? 8 Siege Rhinos. And
I played Whip of Erebos in my Siege Rhino deck at the Pro Tour. It's a good time whipping it back, not just gaining the 4 life from the lifelink, but also getting the drain in extra time.
Sure, I mean that's such a huge kind of life and often tempo swing with a Siege Rhino just, coming just from the graveyard once. You probably didn't set it up with Satyr Wayfinders or anything, did you?
Ended up not. I mean, for a lot of testing I did, had the Satyr Wayfinders, but ended up going with Sylvan Caryatid instead.
So is that just a question of Satyr Wayfinder being not as not as good of a card in and of itself versus Sylvan Caryatid, or did you just think that the cards were, a card like Siege Rhino especially, or Whip of Erebos, which are both essentially game-winning cards for 4 mana, they kind of had the ability to stand on their own without synergistic help, or what was the thinking there?
So part of the reason why I got into Seder Wayfinder in the first place is I noticed that with Abzan, I wanted to sideboard out Sylvan Caryatid in some key matchups. I didn't want Sylvan Caryatid against control decks, obviously, because you end up with just too much mana, and you just want to have more threats. And it doesn't block anything.
Go ahead for a second. It's actually not obvious, I bet, to a lot of listeners.
Okay, well then, sorry.
So if you're playing,
I only meant the reason.
Oh, of course. But just let this is a good nugget. I think maybe let's dwell on this for a second. So when you say control decks, you mean decks with Anger of the Gods, decks with End Hostilities, decks with Perilous Vault, or just decks that are slower than you?
So, like, for that area specifically, blue decks with card draw and sweepers, blue decks that try to take control of the game using removal, permission, and card draw, that don't have anything you can block with a Sylvan Caryatid. And this actually came up a lot for me at the Pro Tour, the Block Pro Tour, which is where this first started, where I really first started having this experience with Sylvan Caryatid. I was playing an Abzan deck there as well, and one of the things I was finding against the control decks, like the Sultai control decks that so many of my teammates ended up playing, they use a removal spell to get rid of one of your cards. You thought seize them, they thought seize you. You just keep crashing your cards into each other, and then one person ends up with 1 mana too much, and the other person ends up with 1 threat, and the threat starts generating a big advantage, whether it's an Ashiok or a Courser of Crufix or an Elspeth or whatever it is. And Sylvan Caryatid, I ended up cutting down on. I often will trim in ramp decks, in decks with tons of mana, or even just green decks with things like Elvish Mystic. It's a common sideboard strategy to sideboard out some of your alternate mana sources against a control deck or any kind of a deck that has a lot of 1-for-1 reactive cards, so that you end up with a few more threats. You got to be careful. You need your mana base to still function, but Sylvan Caryatid is a little bit of a liability against some of these people because it's a mana source that can't be your first or second mana source, and it dies to their sweepers. And if you can't block with Sylvan Caryatid, and you and your opponent are trading 1-for-1 a whole lot, it can be really tough when you it diminishes some of the power of your Courser of Crufix, because later in the game, your Courser of Crufix makes it so that every time you hit a mana, you're sort of drawing a card, and then if you don't hit a mana, well, at least you have business. You have a spell. The worst is when you have Courser of Crufix, you have tons of mana, you just need some action, and then your top card is a Sylvan Caryatid. Not only do you not get the free card from playing it off a Courser, next turn you're going to have to draw a brick.
So let me pause you on that for a second, because this actually comes up for me a lot. Maybe I didn't have the Patrick Chapin tech of taking out a lot of my mana acceleration in certain matchups, but I can tell you I've been playing a lot of Sylvan Caryatid, Courser of Crufix decks over the last few months, and if you play those kind of decks enough, you get in these situations quite often where you're in the mid game and you can see the top of your library, and the top card of your library is a Sylvan Caryatid or an Elvish Mystic, right? If you have a Windswept Heath or the equivalent in play, is that a signal for you to break that land just because you want a better spell than that to draw? Or what I often think is, look, if I break this here and then just have a land on top, then I'm going to draw a land. It's terrible. At least I'm drawing a spell. That's typically what my guiding principle is in those situations.
Well, so that's part of what makes Windswept Heath and all the fetch lands really so incredible with Courser of Crufix, and has just shot it up into the stratosphere. Later in the game, you don't just crack your fetch land just to thin your deck. Much the opposite. You let it sit and play because you want to get another shot where that when the top of your deck has a spell that you don't really want, like Elvish Mystic or or Sylvan Caryatid once you have tons of mana, if the top card of your deck is a spell you don't want, cracking the fetch land, first of all, ensures that it's like a free scry where next turn you'll draw something different, right? So already it's like a scry land that didn't come into play tapped. But even beyond that, if the top card of your deck turns out to be a mana, now you're going to get to draw another card. If the top card of your deck is a land, you'll get to effectively draw another card because you would have just drawn that card next turn, and now you get to go a card deeper than that. So you really want to save things like Windswept Heath. If you have a Corrosive Cruffix in play, and actually, honestly, even if you don't have a Corrosive Cruffix in play, usually once I have enough land so that I can cast all my spells, like once we're in a legitimate like stage 3 type of situation where I can cast whatever spell I want, I just let Windswept Heath sit and play. And actually, I try to avoid breaking it as much as possible. If I have any way to be able to cast my spells without breaking the Windswept Heath, I'll try to do that as much as possible, which includes sometimes tapping it for a black when there's an Urborg in play.
Absolutely.
Because you really want to save the fetch lands to try to get value out of them, because if you just crack it early on, you have a tiny % lower chance of drawing a land every turn. That even hurts your Corrosive Cruffix, who wants there to be land on top of your deck. But if you wait until you have a card on top of your deck that you want to get rid of, and because it's not even just a spell that you don't want. Sometimes you're in a spot where your top card is a land, so you play the land off the top, and then your top card is another land. That's a perfect spot to crack your Windswept Heath, because you want to try to avoid drawing lands once you have that many. You want the top card of your deck to be land when you haven't played one yet, but if you've already played one, shuffle it away. It's like drawing an extra card.
So, awesome tip. I think that's very helpful for folks who are looking to play with Sylvan Caryatid and especially Corrosive Cruffix. So, can you run down how a player would just play an Abzan deck in general? Think about the kind of opening hands you would have and what you want to think about, as you go through the mid game and how you would approach different kinds of opponents. You just came off a Grand Prix a few weeks ago where you were tied for top 8. Congratulations and condolences, but for 9th. But you're obviously very, very capable of piloting these kinds of decks.
Let's see. I came in 9th with an Abzan deck that. I had played Abzan on the Pro Tour shortly before that, but I actually tweaked my list a fair bit after seeing Ari Lax's Abzan deck. I thought that those guys, Ari Lax and all the people he tested with, they just killed it. Absolutely love their list. The Greater Planeswalker focus, I think, adds a lot of power and a lot of it's a good way to have threats that are good against control, but are also good against other people. But anyway, yeah, I played it there and absolutely loved it. Had ended up tied for, came in 9th on Breakers. Anyway, I kind of knew I was going to be 9th on Breakers going into the last round, but the sort of things you look for when playing it are so to begin with, your opening hand. You want to have having your mana base. And a plan of how you're going to assemble your mana base is the early priority. You want to make sure you learn the patterns of how to fix your mana, which order to play your lands in. Like, for instance, in general, you want to play your tri-land, your Sand Steep Citadel. You want to play Sand Steep Citadel before any of the temples, any of the scry lands. And that's true for most decks. In general, if you don't have a compelling reason, a very good rule of thumb is play tri-lands before you play your temples. The spot where the most common reason why you would play the temple before the tri-land is in a spot where you're looking for something specific. Like for instance, if you have a bunch of lands already, and it includes a bunch of temples and a bunch of tri-lands, so that your colors are already fixed. If you know that based on the contents of your hand, you're not going to do anything on the third turn, it's very reasonable to play a temple and look for a 3-drop. On turn 3, play a temple so that there's a chance, so you have an increased chance of finding something that you can play next turn so you can stay on curve. The main reason is if you're looking for something specific, The other big reason would be if you're getting beaten down really hard and don't have a removal spell where you're just desperate, But all things being equal, in general, you want to play Tri-lands before temples unless you absolutely need something right now. And part of the reason for this is, one, the Tri-lands fix your mana even better and give you more options. But two, the more important thing is that the longer you wait on the temple, the more information you'll have to make your decision. And that's why if you need to make a decision right now, you need to. But if you are just hanging out, if you're just playing your cards, well, if you play the temple one turn later, you'll have one more draw phase to help inform what you're looking for. Like maybe right now you would really like a hero's downfall and a creature and a planeswalker. Well, if next turn you draw a hero's downfall, well, now you have some more information. You might not want a second hero's downfall, or you might be like, I really need a second black to cast this hero's downfall. But if you just draw a black mana for the turn, you might want to scry a third black mana to the bottom. So in general, you want to try to save the temples until you need to use them. Which is not, you should still play them as early as you can compared to tap lands, But, compared to untapped lands, but yeah, early on you're trying to set up your mana. You want to try to use your fetch lands, your temples, and just play your cards in such an order. Sylvan Caryatid, you want to spend your first couple turns setting up your mana so that you can play the rest of your cards. Each turn play the card. Usually you're going to play about one card per turn, and you want to try to play whichever card is best in the situation, which if it depends on this is where it really depends on which style of an Abzan deck you're playing. If you're the aggressor or if you're more if you're being the more mid-rangey or controlling version.
I was playing an Abzan deck, like I said earlier, tonight, and I played against an Abzan opponent who had main deck Drowned in Sorrow and main deck End Hostilities. So,
yeah, I actually played both of those at the Pro Tour. Played 2 End Hostilities and a Drowned in Sorrow in the main deck, and at the Grand Prix I actually moved the End Hostilities to the sideboard because Green Devotion was so much on the downswing. But I think it's a totally reasonable card to play, particularly if you think that all the various green decks, whether it's Abzan, Mono Green, Sultai.
Sweepers obviously work so well with the planeswalkers that you have available. You can just throw your creatures out there as chumpers to protect the planeswalkers, and then use it in hostilities and leave a card like Sorin Solemn Visitor or Elspeth Sun's Champion in play. Just be a dramatic advantage against an opponent who all his permanents are creatures.
Oh yeah, particularly when you have cards like Thoughtseize. Thoughtseize letting you take a look at their hand. They might have a mixture of cards where you can take the big follow-up threat that they would play after your End Hostilities. Like often people will try to fight a sweeper like End Hostilities by saving something big to play after. And Thoughtseize removes that counterplay.
So this is actually something we discussed kind of offline earlier this week, which is where you should play Thoughtseize, if anywhere. And I've been, like I said earlier, I've been playing a lot of Standard, and most of my kind of mid-range-ish aggro decks, Abzan, or I also played a bit of Orzhov, which I think is very fun, inspired by your deck from Ireland last year, actually. Although it is lacking all of your favorite cards in Standard, there's no Siege Rhino in
I don't know. It has.
Abzan. I'm sorry, in Orzhov.
Yeah, it has Heroes Downfall, Elspeth, and Thoughtseize, right?
Yeah, it starts.
But those are literally my 4, 5, and 6.
Well,
pretty early on. I guess Sylvan Caryatid would be.
We start on Soldier of the Pantheon, and then play Seeker of the Way, which you got. What was the name of the guy you played? The sapling making guy.
Precinct Captain.
So there's no more Precinct Captain, but I can play Seeker of the Way. He's very good in this deck if you follow up with a removal spell or read the bones on the third turn.
It's just a quality Magic card.
And then 4 copies of Brimaz, King of Ereskos, which when it came out, you said to me was not a realistic Magic card.
Yep.
And that I really like the Orzhov deck. It's lacking some of the oomph of decks that can play, Sorin a turn faster, or of course Siege Rhino, which is one of the best cards in Standard and largely the topic of this podcast. But it has the thing I like about Orzhov is there's a lot of fast removal. You can just play a lot of Bile Blights and you're swinging with your 1-drops, 2-drops, and 3-drops while you're kind of tempo killing all the opponent's guys. The green decks don't really have that character. They're cheaper creatures like Sylvan Caryatid and Courser of Kruphix are fairly defensive.
Yeah, absolutely. The black-white deck has more lands that come into play untapped and easier requirements on its mana. And some of your choices, like, the fact that you defend yourself with things like Soldier of the Pantheon and Seeker of the Way, the fact that those can switch into a very aggressive mode, you can just curve out sometimes, Soldier of the Pantheon into Seeker of the Way into Brimaz, suddenly you're a white weenie deck.
Oh yeah, it very much feels like that. And if you're kind of really pressuring a control opponent with 1, 2, 3 drops, they oftentimes have to tap more mana than they'd like to on the 3rd or 4th turn, which lets you stick Sorin Solemn Visitor. And you wouldn't think that Sorin Solemn Visitor would be that great against control, but if you can get the ultimate off, a lot of the time a control deck can't win at all. Right, you completely lock out somebody who's trying to win with Prognostic Sphinx or Pearl Lake Ancient.
Yeah, I mean it can be a pretty powerful threat against them, but also part of it is just that it's a way to commit a threat that forces them to do something really awkward, like have to find a Banishing Light or a Perilous Vault or something, because if it's really hard for a lot of those decks to attack Planeswalkers.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, if they have a Hero's Downfall, that's another way they can get out of it. But even then, you're still getting 2 for 1. And what more do you want in life but a 2 for 1?
Well, Mike Long taught me that at Grand Prix Boston in 2003. So let's see. I sent you a whip-based Abzan deck. We'll talk about it a little bit, and then maybe move on a little bit to other topics. We'll put the list in the show notes for this episode. But basically, it's 4 Whip of Erebos. Well, it's 4 of everything: Whip of Erebos, Elvish Mystic, Satyr Wayfinder, Sylvan Caryatid, Courser of Kruphix, Arbor Colossus, See the Unwritten, Ashen Rider, Siege Rhino, and then 24 lands. So it's literally all spells except for 4 Whip of Erebos, which is obviously very, very different from the flexible sort of Abzan decks that you've been playing this year.
You're talking about creatures, like it's all creatures and things that get creatures?
Yeah, so instead of removing your opponent's best threat, you're just seeking to block it with Satyr Wayfinder for a turn while you play powerful threats. The thing I liked about this deck is that you could either use Satyr Wayfinder or Attrition, right? Blocking, getting your stuff destroyed, etc. To get things into the graveyard that are very powerful and undercosted, like Siege Rhino or especially Ashen Rider, and you whip them back for value. Or you can just have a large creature that sets up a See the Unwritten, which is extremely powerful if you have a large enough creature in play. So, and it's unusual to play 4 Arbor Colossus main deck, right?
Definitely.
I just wanted to have a guy that I can go like 5 mana Arbor Colossus, 6 mana See the Unwritten, and I didn't really think that there was much better that I could play in that slot, especially if at the time that I made the deck, which was actually several weeks ago, originally there were a lot of Mantis Riders, and it was before the rise of the combo version, the combo aggro version of Jeskai Heroic. So if I thought there'd be a lot of Jeskai Heroic, I probably wouldn't play this deck. It's a bit clunky for the opponent just will have a shot to combo kill you or even run you over with beaters. But if opponents are playing largely mid-range decks like just traditional Jeskai or traditional Abzan, I think it has good play in Standard.
So how much have you played with this list?
A couple dozen matches.
Word. All right. Yeah. The thing I see is it's 24 land and 12 alternative mana sources for a total of 36 mana sources. So this is definitely functionally a green devotion deck.
Yep.
You know, like you're trying to go over the top with haymakers like Arbor Colossus, See the Unwritten, Ashen Rider. You know, you've got Siege Rhino instead of Palakranos, and Ashen Rider instead of Hornet Queen. But this is basically a green devotion deck.
That's a very accurate observation. So, you know, prior to the Pro Tour, I won a Grand Prix trial with Green Devotion, and that really very much colors how I was approaching green in Standard. Just like really not playing an interactive game with my opponent, kind of just amassing my own resources and then doing something awesome was kind of where I was.
Yeah, it looks like whereas Green Devotion decks will often use Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, as a way to turbo cheat, you know, in addition to all the accelerators. You've got Whip of Erebos to reanimate things. And obviously you also have, you see the Unwritten a little harder in this list than a lot of the Green Devotion decks do, just because Arbor Colossus and Siege Rhino on top of Ashen Rider is so many ways to trigger it. It's definitely, it looks like the type of deck that could be vulnerable to a reactive strategy that can neutralize its threats just because it's a little light on threats total. I mean, all of its threats hit very hard. It's got 20 game-winning threats, but then the rest of the deck is mana. And so I know that like Green Devotion has historically been good against traditional Abzan. I wouldn't be surprised if this list is as well. You know, if you've been having success against the mid-range decks, that seems exactly like what this deck is trying to beat up on. It seems like one of the big advantages of this deck, of this version of Abzan compared to traditional Abzan, is I bet you're pretty good against. Like, I bet you actually just stomp on the red green X decks like Teamer or red green monsters, and like the combination of Arbor Colossus and Siege Rhino and See the Unwritten. And I mean, just it seems, and Whip of Erebos even. It seems like you'd be very good against what is one of traditional Abzan's hard matchups.
Oh, sure. 4 Arbor Colossus plus 4 Whip of Erebos is a lot of Stormbreath Dragon defense. That's for sure.
Yeah. It seems like the place where you probably would take the hit would be against the combo decks and control decks that have things like End Hostilities.
Yep.
You know? Or if you face another Abzan deck that happens to be heavy on End Hostilities.
Counterspell control seems to be the toughest thing. But like I said, I wouldn't really consider playing this deck if I thought people were going to play combo Jeskai Heroic. But I think if they just play like regular Heroic, I'd be fairly comfortable, especially Drown and Sorrow, etc., coming out of the sideboard. The one thing I don't like about this deck, though, is I only had room for 2 copies of Sorin Solemn Visitor in the sideboard, which is Sorin Solemn Visitor is pretty much my favorite card in Standard, I think.
Yeah, it's really weird that you don't have any in the main deck.
Yeah, I mean, but this deck doesn't. It's like it just doesn't fit here. So
it's not as good. It's not as good without the spells. The spells really help Sorin. You know, like Thoughtseize and Hero's Downfall, Murderous Cut, Abzan Charm.
Yes, those are all true. I also like playing traditional Abzan. I think it's a very rewarding deck to play. You know, you have Abzan Charms and Read the Bones, and you're like, oh, just drawing cards is cool, or removing threats is cool, and kind of grinding out victories with small edges. That's a very fun way to play Magic, I think.
Actually, on the topic of Read the Bones, kind of interesting antidote there. Pro Tour Khans of Tarkir, very few of the Abzan decks actually had Read the Bones in them. But what I eventually realized was that if you want to sideboard out Sylvan Caryatid in a lot of matchups, you know, and we touched on sideboarding out against Control earlier, I also sideboarded out against Green Devotion, and I sideboarded out in the Mirror. And the reason is there's different reasons for each one. Against Green Devotion, I want to be heavy on sweepers. and blowing up my own mana is kind of a losing proposition. It also becomes very attrition-y after sideboard because a lot of the Green Devotion decks will sideboard in Thoughtseize of their own and so on. But against Abzan, in the mirror, it becomes extremely attrition-y. You're trying to bash your cards into theirs. You Thoughtseize them, they Thoughtseize you. You Heroes Downfall them. They Abzan Charm your guy. Next thing you know, you both are completely out of resources. So you want to be lower. You want to be lower on mana, just like against the control decks.
In the Abzan mirror match, is Dune Blast king?
I don't know. I mean, everybody loves Dune Blast, and I played one at the Grand Prix, and it was fine. I don't know if it's really that much better than End Hostilities. It is better than End Hostilities in that matchup, but End Hostilities has applications in other matchups. So I wouldn't want to play very many Doom Blast, but it is a solid card. It's not the thing that really decides the matchup, though. The matchup is really it's about who manipulates their Courser of Kruphix better. And there's actually and who scries. Really, it's just about who scries better. Obviously, if one person coursers and the other one doesn't, the person who's coursering is going to get a huge advantage. But one of the things I like so much about the Abzan mirror match is that it's kind of the opposite direction of the old Jund decks. The old Jund decks, there was so much play to so many of the matchups, but the mirror was miserable. The mirror, there just wasn't enough you could do. Abzan is totally the other way. The amount of scrying and deciding when to shuffle and deciding what mode to use your charm and deciding what ability of your planeswalker to activate and deciding which creature to kill with your removal spells and which card to take with Thoughtseize. There's so many decisions. But doubling back to the point about Sylvan Caryatid, once we realized that we want to board out Sylvan Caryatid against Abzan, Green Devotion, and control decks, I wanted some way to keep my mana still functional. 25 land is just not enough to cast Elspeths against these people. And I originally was considering actually even splitting Satyr Wayfinder and Sylvan Caryatid because having a couple Satyr Wayfinders, that's a way to get mana that doesn't get destroyed by the sweepers. And it's not the greatest threat in the world, but at least it is a creature that can do some damage in the attrition-y matchups.
You could put some +1/+1 counters on him too.
Definitely, and he gets pumped by Sorin, and he makes your whip better if you have whip. But in the end, I, instead of doing the crazy 2 Caryatid, 2 Satyr Wayfinder split, just went with 4 Caryatids once I realized that I could board and read the bones. And at the Pro Tour, I was just boarding a whole bunch of Read the Bones, but by the time the Grand Prix rolled around, I had 1 Read the Bones in the main deck and 2 more in the sideboard. I think might have even had 2 in the main deck, 1 in the board, but no, I think it was 1 in the main deck, 2 in the board. But being able to board in a couple Read the Bones can help smooth out your mana draws, where maybe your deck is a little lighter on mana than you would like, but you can use your Read the Bones to help find the mana you need for Elspeth in all the games where you're a little light. And from the looks of it, that's become a fairly popular strategy, adding Read the Bones, which gives you some added ways to fight attrition decks and another tool against control.
Yeah, it makes sense. There are so many of these matchups are resource fights, right? Like,
definitely
nobody's killing anybody else. Everybody's got enough removal to kill everybody else's creatures. My 4/5 Siege Rhino bounces off of your 4/5 Siege Rhinos. Ultimately, it gets to be about a game about who has more material. And Read the Bones not only gets you more raw material, right, 2 cards for 1, but especially late game, you can just filter away those lands that it's revealing and really just, I think, get a huge jump on your opponent.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, Read the Bones is kind of a draw 3.
So, speaking of drawing 3, earlier this week you told me that you thought there were only 3 good Magic cards in Standard. You want to talk about those 3 cards?
Sure, and keep in mind that's slightly hyperbolic.
Slightly, yeah. Only 3.
I do think that there's only 3 cards that are in the running for being the best card in Standard, which is Siege Rhino, Courser of Crufix, and Dig Through Time. That said, I think that Sylvan Caryatid, Thoughtseize, Hero's Downfall, Elspeth, Sun's Champion, those are all very strong cards. I mean, honestly, Mantis Rider is quite good too. Each one of them though, each one of the top 3, Siege Rhino, Dig Through Time, and Courser of Crufix, I think you can make an argument for being the best card, just being the strongest card contextually
in Standard.
In Standard right now,
so
I do think Dig Through Time is the best one in Vintage out of those 3.
Yeah, in Vintage, I have a hard time getting behind Dig Through Time in Standard. I don't see it. I think maybe that's because, the team you played on for the Pro Tour, you got such talented players who chose to play blue and blue-black control decks and just put a real show on with Dig Through Time. But, it's this kind of fringe card in Jeskai. It's not flashing. I mean, maybe my perspective is off, right? Just because it's not flashing right now, that doesn't mean that it's not. I think the card is super duper. I think it's a flawed strategy. I love control decks, man. I'd play a control deck for sure if I thought it was good, or if I thought it was the best. But the Dig Through Time is much, much stronger than the other cards available for a control deck. The problem is that you end up playing this deck full of second-rate cards, and then you try to just make up for it with Dig Through Time. And honestly, Dig Through Time is so good that you can do a very reasonable job of this. You can build a control deck that can beat any 2 or 3 things you want, but you can't beat everything. And the raw power is just not there compared to a deck like Abzan or Jeskai or Mardu that's just playing all good cards. So, speaking of good cards, this is my list that I like in Standard. I actually have Courser of Crufix first. I think it's really...
Oh, yeah. That's a totally reasonable answer.
So rewarding for me. I actually have Sylvan Caryatid second. I think Sylvan Caryatid... They always go together, and, they're... Not always. They're buddies.
Not always. Most of the time, but not always. Sylvan Caryatid sometimes hangs out without Courser in the Jeskai Ascendancy combo decks, like the old school ones. And Courser sometimes hangs out without Caryatid in some of the red green monster decks.
Really? I don't think I've ever seen Courser without Caryatid in the slow decks. But.
Oh, yeah. Like Brian Kibler at the Pro Tour, a lot of them were talking about playing, not wanting to play Caryatid. They just want to play threats.
It doesn't bust.
Yeah.
And then obviously Siege Rhino. I think my favorite card to play in Standard, though, like I said before, is Sorin Solemn Visitor. It just levels up so fast, and then
card's great.
You just kill your opponent. It's awesome, and the amount of swing that it gives you, just giving everybody +1 for 1 attack, even if it's going to die. Like your opponent's got burn spells for it, or they've got flyers and they can take it down.
Yeah, but a lot of the time you can drop it and then just boom, just gain 10 life that turn or something. And then it's just completely unreasonable for your opponent to ever claw back, even if they throw away everything to kill it.
Yeah, the card is just fantastic. I love playing it. And then, I've Thoughtseize. I think Seeker of the Way is a really good card. I think it's a top 10 quality card. How do you feel about Seeker of the Way? Do you think it's in that class?
I think Seeker of the Way is great. I don't know if I would make it top 10. But it's certainly top 20, and I think there's a very good argument to be made for top 10. Card's fantastic. There's only a couple good 2-drops in the format, and it's one of them.
Yeah, there's not very good offensive 2-drops in the format. There's very good cards like Sylvan Caryatid that you can play for 2 mana.
Well, there aren't that many cards like Sylvan Caryatid. There's basically Sylvan Caryatid.
And...
Done.
Let's see. Jeskai Ascendancy, Mantis Rider at Jeskai Mana. And then I think, I was looking at your deck list from the Grand Prix. Did it kill you inside to play only 3 Elspeths?
No, not at all.
Nope. You're always just you got to play 4 Elspeths to me. So I always play 4 because you told me to.
It depends. Keep in mind, once you're playing Abzan Charms and Read the Bones and so on, you do draw more cards. But in that spot, it's just a curve consideration. In block, there's no way I would play less than 4 Elspeths. Are you kidding? But in standard, there's so many other good cards, too, that it is defensible to play less than 4 Elspeths. Also, part of it is that they designed a whole bunch of cards to be really good against Elspeth. And...
Like Siege Rhino?
Well, Siege Rhino, to a degree, yeah. One of the poster child of accidental Elspeth hate is actually Hornet Queen. When I saw Hornet Queen, I was like, oh my god, they literally designed that to be the perfect card against these people, against the cards that are good right now, because look at the cards that are good. There's Hero's Downfall, doesn't beat a Hornet Queen. Bile Blight doesn't really beat a Hornet Queen for a token maker. They still have a guy. Elspeth, oh my god, it's literally, the numbers line up so perfect. I thought I was like, man, this has to be by design. Because if you put down, even if you play the Elspeth first, the Hornet Queen kills it exactly in one hit. And Elspeth's tokens can't block the bees. And Elspeth's -3 ability doesn't hit the bees, despite the fact that it's 6 power.
And, the Hornet Queen is so consistently played in the same decks as Setessan Tactics. So even if you amass a bunch of tokens... Right?
Well, no. But see, here's the thing. Even if the Elspeth goes first and makes the tokens... the Hornet Queen wins the race partly because the 2/2 Queen becomes the Abyss. Like, if even an Elspeth on curve, on the play, it loses the race against a Hornet Queen.
I've been on the wrong side of this enough times to agree with you vehemently.
Yeah, but the point is just that there's a lot of cards that line up well against Elspeth right now. Like Sarkhan the Dragon Speaker. Fantastic card. It's pretty strong against Elspeth. It does a great job of shoring up some of the weaknesses that Stormbreath Dragon had.
I had Sarkhan Dragon Speaker in my top 10, my first draft of it, but he's maybe around 12 or 13 for me right now. I don't think he makes the top 10.
Butcher of the Horde is another anti-Elspeth card. It just comes down immediately and -5s the, attacks Elspeth and hits it for 5. That same turn. Flying over the tokens.
How do you feel about Wingmate Rock?
Oh, that's a good card. I wouldn't put it in the top 10, but it's a good card.
Wingmate Rock versus Brimaz, King of Ereskos.
I think Wingmate Rock is better contextually. I think Brimaz is a more powerful card on rate, but the key is that there are so many incredible 3-drops in the format right now, and the format's a little hostile towards Brimaz, whereas Wingmate Rock is a 5-drop, and there aren't as many 5-drops for the colors that would actually play Wingmate Rock. Like Red has all the good 5-drops in the world, but White, and honestly, Black and Green. I mean, in an Abzan deck, in my opinion, the only real options besides Planeswalkers. I mean, you do have things like Ajani and Liliana and so on, but the only real options are Arbor Colossus and Wingmate Rock. And I actually played Arbor Colossus at the Pro Tour, and I played Wingmate Rock at the Grand Prix, and I could see playing either one. But I think that Brimaz got a lot worse with Khans of Tarkir because of things like, for instance, Abzan Charm hits things that have 3 or more strength, 3 or more power instead of 4 or more, and Stoke the Flames from N15.
Oh, it's a perfect card against Brimaz.
Absolutely.
The reason I like Brimaz contextually, though, is when this format turned over initially, right, Khans of Tarkir became initially legal and standard, all I played was Course of Krufix and Sylvan Caryatid decks. And Brimaz is such a great creature to attack into a Sylvan Caryatid with.
Oh, absolutely.
Just unbelievable. Like, typically the Sylvan... this is before there was a huge... it's not even an initial push. It was kind of like the renaissance of Titan strength in red decks, right? Which, Tom Ross has brought back again. But, usually you just block with your Sylvan Caryatid anything that's not 3 or greater power, and, that comes down to the first 3 turns of the game and just doesn't get past it. But Brimaz has 3 power. It's just such an amazing card on rate. 3 mana for a 3/4 with that ability. That set of abilities, rather.
I gotta take a step back, because in all seriousness, I think you might be right on this one. While I played Wingmate Rock over Brimaz at the last Grand Prix, thinking back, first of all, I like playing with more of the planeswalkers, and once you start playing with less creatures, it starts becoming harder to trigger your Wingmate Rock. And I've seen some Abzan decks that basically were just the same as my Grand Prix deck, but they added 2 Brimazes to. And that kind of looks appealing to me. I mean, I would absolutely love to play Brimaz in these decks. So I think you might be right. I think it might be time for Brimaz to make a big comeback in some of these decks.
My Orzhov deck has 4 Brimaz and 4 Sorin Solemn Visitor. You just go like Brimaz followed by Sorin. Like Sylvan Carry, I'm sorry, Courser of Kruvix can't block anymore either. The racing ability with this combination of cards, and like you said before, you have so much less reliance on lands that come into play tapped. It's oppressive offensively. Like if you think about how there's at least 3 different classes of decks that when you're playing Abzan, you take out your mana accelerators, right? You take out your Sylvan Caryatids. In a sense, this kind of deck is already pre-sideboarded against those because it just doesn't have Sylvan Caryatid. Right. But like it has a different kind of speed. You
got any Read the Bones in there? You could get me. If you can get Read the Bones in there.
I have four. What's the black one? Sign and Blood.
Sign and Blood.
I have 4 Sign and Blood and 2 Read the Bones in my main, and 2 more Read the Bones in my sideboard. So I can go to 8 after sideboarding.
That's not bad.
Because you just play this attrition game against mid-range creature decks. Like my deck has every Bile Blight and Hero's Downfall and Banishing Light in the world, and I have like 3 or 4 End Hostilities after sideboarding. You just remove everything, and you have so much life gain with 4 Seeker of the Way, 4 Sorin Solemn Visitor, and some Wingmate Rocks for that matter. Like
dude, that sounds pretty sweet.
I really like it. I mean, it kind of breaks the paradigm that we like to talk about playing the best cards. Like it doesn't have.
Yeah, and that's why I would want to just splash Siege Rhino in there and then maybe get Courser Crufix and throw it all out the window.
So I made this deck and I'm like, oh, well, I can just make the green version of this deck. And, and it has a lot of the same incentives, but it's pretty much just the deck you played at the Grand Prix at that point. And you lose that offensive speed that you get from playing with Soldier of the Pantheon. There's so many decks that are just, they're really soft to first turn Soldier, second turn Seeker of the Way, Spell.
Man, dude, when we're playing a Soldier of the Pantheon deck, we've got to get them. This has got to be 4 Read the Bones, 2 Sign and Blood, not 4 Sign and Blood, 2 Read the Bones. Dude, Read the Bones is so much better than Sign and Blood anyway. And how many planes do you have in there?
I don't have the list.
5?
I don't know. There's a ton, man.
7?
I don't know. I don't remember. I could look it up, but
dude, we make sure to post that list because that list sounds hot.
All right, so I'll tell you what. I have one word answer for you. Done. It's fine. We'll flip those numbers, and then actually, I can't cotton playing.
Hey, actually, hold on. Maybe you shouldn't post this deck.
Yeah,
I might play this deck at Worlds. Maybe you shouldn't.
All right, so we won't post this deck.
No, go ahead.
I actually wrote an article about it already.
They'll think I'm bluffing. They'll think I'm bluffing anyway.
I actually think you'd love this deck. That's
I know I would. I've been hearing what you've been saying.
It's my favorite deck to play in Standard. So, on that, what I wanted to get at is I think that Brimaz, King of Rescos, is the most underrated card in Standard. I think he's just the opinion I formed on this. I mean, you'd already told me, when it came out, that you thought it was an unrealistic Magic card, which is something that you don't see so often. You obviously won a Pro Tour with him earlier this year, but the thing that really turned me was I was watching Owen play on day 2 of the Pro Tour, and he's playing his blue-black control deck, and his opponent just plays a Brimaz, and Owen's got Disdainful Stoke in his hand, and he just can't counter it, and he just slides under.
Oh, yeah, he's just got Bile Blight, Disdainful Stroke.
He's got a Bile Blight and Disdainful Stroke.
And his big plan is that next turn he can cast a Perilous Vault, and the turn after that he can activate it. And this is if he draws an untapped land and his opponent doesn't destroy it with like an Utter End or something.
Yeah, so
or Thoughtseize him next turn.
It's exactly right. His opponent can have a Thoughtseize or a Banishing Light. And his plan is just horrendous. And Brimaz literally just does like 17 damage or something. He's got a buddy or 2 every single turn. And I was just like, this guy.
Well, it does 15 damage in the first 3 turns alone.
So the other
it's a 3-drop that puts him on a 4-turn clock.
The other thing I thought was crazy is if Brad Nelson and those guys are playing just red-white aggro decks, how are they playing the Mog thing that makes 3 goblins on 3? Just instead of Brimaz. Brimaz on body is 3/4 instead of 3 1/1s, and he catches up pretty quick.
Well, it's because of the desire from them to go after all the Heroes Downfall people.
Yeah,
obviously, the Hordling outburst. So first, there is some amount of synergy with like Seeker of the Way.
Yeah, it's obviously the Seeker of the Way synergy.
That's good. That's good. But then even beyond that, and I'm not saying I agree with them because Brimaz is a way stronger card than a Hordling Outburst. I'm just saying that the reason behind it is surely they were specifically trying to build a Mardu deck to go after Abzan decks. And that is one matchup where the Hordling Outburst, it kind of plays into their token theme too.
So, I mean, the reason that I like Brimaz as a solution to Hordling Outburst is I feel like it's just such a similar card. Same casting cost. It does a very similar thing, but with so much upside. And in addition, I don't know how pervasive the card Goblin Rabblemaster is anymore, but he's just insane against Goblin Rabblemaster. Like, you're spitting 1/1 goblins out, he's just like chews on them and makes buddies.
Yeah. If he sticks around, then he obviously completely dominates the head-to-head. The problem, though, is that Goblin Rabblemaster decks will often have like 20 ways to stop a Brimaz. Like they'll have like, for instance, the Jeskai decks playing 4 Jeskai Charm, 4 Stoke the Flames, some amount of Banishing Lights.
Even a Lightning Strike, right?
A Lightning Strike can do it too. Absolutely, because you're going to block the Goblin. What are you going to do? Not block the Goblin?
Of course, that's
right. You have
the
to.
Lightning Strike is opportune there.
Right. So it's a dangerous game you play, but yes, if you survive, you dominate the head-to-head. That said, part of what makes it so good in your deck is that when you can clear a path with Thoughtseize, it's game on.
So, I know you're preparing for Worlds, not F&M, but I would guess that most of our listeners are not quite so lucky.
No. Actually, funny enough, preparing for Worlds is more like preparing for an F&M than Pro Tours are. No, in all seriousness.
Yeah, there's
I'll
very
tell you
few
why.
players.
Well, part of it is when you go to your F&M, it's not a random distribution of people. You have some amount of information about what the styles are of the local people that you play at your store. The World Championships, it's like I'm playing at a store with 23 people I know, 23 of my friends. I got an idea of the sorts of things that the people at the game store play. Like, for instance, what are the chances that Willie Edel plays a black-green deck in Modern?
Pretty high.
Pretty high.
I know that's a lot of top 8s with black-green variants.
Right, exactly. So at a Pro Tour, you have to prepare for a field of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And at a Grand Prix, you got to prepare for thousands of people.
Tell me about it.
Worlds is just like an F&M. No, it's just like an F&M.
If you had to play F&M this week, what would you play?
Abzan,
yeah. I think I'd play black-white. It's so fun to play.
That said, I think that it's important to note, I think that you should play black-white. I think that I should play Abzan because the last time I played Standard, I played Abzan and liked it, and I'm going to be doing a whole lot more playing of Standard in this next week and a half. Paul Rietzel's coming into town to help prepare for Worlds, and so my answer next week would be very different than this week. But I think that the fact that I haven't been playing a ton since the last time I played Abzan, I think that Abzan's a great deck, but I think there's a lot of good decks, and you should play something that something you're comfortable with and familiar with, because the difference between the best deck and the fourth best deck is not, it's not like a dramatic amount.
So, the last time you and Paul Rietzel played Soldier of the Pantheon Orzhov decks, you guys both did pretty well, as I recall.
Yeah, that he top 8'd and I finished ninth ninth clean cut, but ninth at Pro Tour Flores. Yeah, we actually know we played black white again at Pro Tour M15, but that particular black white deck did not have Soldier of the Pantheon.
You played the mid range deck. Is that the same one that Owen made top 8 with?
Yeah,
Owen and Huey,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah, Owen and Huey ended up. We had a big meeting, and they knew that Paul and I had played the most with black white. And I still remember, Owen coming up to Paul and I and saying, like during that meeting, everything that we said, everything that he disagreed on, he slept on it, and the next morning just decided the hell with it, and just did it the way that he just, like, each of the areas that he disagreed with the Sun, he just decided his gut was that he should just trust what we were talking about. And we said that it's not like some clear-cut thing. This is just what we, our opinion. But he said that each one ended up being exactly right, and each one won him a different match throughout the course of the weekend on his way to that top 8. And that he was, super appreciative of all the hard work that went into helping tune that list.
But this time, Owen will be your enemy.
Oh, I mean, well, part of it is, once there's 24 people, you can't have a million people on every team, So so we splintered into to smaller groups. Like this time, I'm playing with Paul Rietzel, and Owen's playing with Reed and Huey, and Sam Black's just preparing on his own, and Tom Martell is playing with his team GP team, like Shahar and Raptor by extension, but Polo effectively. It's a different dynamic with a tournament this small, but it's going to be an absolute blast.
This is I think everyone's going to be cheering for you. Everyone who's listening to this, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. They're going to be like, down with Reed Duke, up with Patrick. Yeah.
I don't think I can even imagine a world where Magic fans are chanting "Down with Reed Duke." It's not possible. Not even possible.
It's not possible.
I don't know. I think you want to wrap this one up. It's been about an hour, and I think we had some good chats on this.
Sure, but let me give you a couple more minutes. There's a couple things I wanted to mention on Abzan that I think are super important points that I see people missing all the time. And
oh, please, value it in. Value. So,
first of all, for most people, one of the hardest matchups for traditional Abzan are the facing a control deck, particularly a control deck that's used to playing against Abzan decks. And it can be so tough. One of the keys, though, is the getting used to the pace of the game, dictating the pace, because if you just play into them, if you play a card, they kill it, you play a card, they counter it, you play a card, they kill it, you end up in a spot where your last card is Elspeth, their last card is Dig Through Time, or your last card is worse, your last card is Hero's Downfall, and their last card is Dig Through Time, and then they start digging and they start chaining them together, and next thing you know, they have a full hand again. The key is to not walk face first into all their reactive cards. Don't get your cards dissolved. Don't get your cards Hero's Downfalled. It's fine when they do, but you can play around it a little bit. Like, the dream is to stick a threat and then play threats when they react to your threats, or play a threat when you don't have anything on the board. But often what you'll end up doing is wait, as long as you've got lots of lands in your hand, play out your lands and build up. Wait until you have 7 threats in your hand, as long as you can keep hitting your land drops. Often what will end up happening to your opponent, and Yuya Watanabe did this at the Pro Tour to great effect, and the commentators were all marveling at the play, but what's funny is if you face like some of these blue-black control decks, if you don't play anything for them to kill, they end up having to just discard.
Yeah.
Because they don't have any, they literally they're only going to be able to play a land, about 45% of the time.
And they've just got all reactive cards.
And they have all these, and if you just sit there, you can discard things like Hero's Downfall that aren't going to do anything. But you can also just smooth out your hand. Wait till you have like a good mix of cards. And you can do things like Abzan Charm during your opponent's end step, or wait until you can play multiple threats in the same turn. But your opponent's also going to be sitting there with a dig through time, and he can't cast it because he doesn't have any cards in his graveyard. And then eventually he's going to start discarding, and then by the time he actually can cast it, he's not going to want to because his hand is full. And it takes a lot of patience and a lot of discipline to beat them this way. But you can get so much percentage if you practice being super, super patient. And eventually, of course, you got to go for it. Eventually, you set up situations where, on your opponent's, so you have 7 cards and they're all good. On your opponent's end step, each turn he has 8 cards, you let him discard. But finally, he drew a land, so he has 7 cards, you have 7 cards. So you go, Abzan Charm on your end step, I'm up to 8 cards. Then you untap and you draw, I'm up to 9 cards. Now you have 9 cards to his 7. Then you go Thoughtseize to start it off, because anything he could do to stop your Thoughtseize is going to put him even further behind on mana. And then just, stick a threat. And once you stick a threat, stop. Don't walk face first into like end hostilities if he's white, You want to try to set it up so that you don't get blown out by some big card advantage thing.
That's a really, really awesome set of suggestions. I think that there are probably a lot of players who are playing in such a way that they made their opponent's cards good, right? It reminds me of a strategy that Eric Taylor taught me and extended many, many years ago, where if you're playing High Tide against Drago, it seemed at the time like it's just this invincible matchup. Drago could never lose.
Right.
But he's like, well, I'll tell you what. How many counter spells can Drago actually hold? Just like, the answer is 7, right? They have a limit to 7 cards in it. He's like, I'll tell you what.
Right.
Why don't you just focus on playing your Thawing Glaciers, etc., and then just keep playing a land every turn until you have 8 must counter cards.
Right.
So, you're going to...
Same principle.
Yep. On your turn, you can have 8 cards, because they had to discard down to 7. You have 8, and all of a sudden, if you have 8 different cards that are all must counter, their maximum ability is to counter 7 of those cards. The 8th one kills them. And I was just like... And the fact is that when one of your cards is Time Spiral, the 8th card killing them is it's a literal thing. You just reload all of your hand anyway.
You're absolutely right. It's like a jiu-jitsu type of situation. If you walk into them, they will use it against you. But if you just stay back, if you just wait and wait and wait and wait, you can accumulate more tools than they'll be able to deal with.
Yeah, they're not playing, Tom Ross or Brad Nelson's decks in this case. They're not just demolishing you with tokens. They're literally sitting there with the plan of playing a Pearl Lake Ancient 20 turns from now.
Interestingly, I had this situation come up at the GP. When your opponent has a Pearl Lake Ancient and you try to Elspeth to shrink it or to kill it, if your opponent Bile Blights it in response, because it's a fairly but remember to make them get the +1/+1 trigger. Very important. I missed that at the Grand Prix. It didn't end up costing me, fortunately. But if your opponent Bile Blights their own Pearl Lake Ancient, it has to grow up to a 4 power, so it dies anyway.
Because of prowess.
Exactly.
People always forget that guy has prowess.
Oh, yeah. Yep. All right, and then the final, Abzan thing that I think is so underrated, so underappreciated, is Abzan Charm bluffing. I think a lot of people don't give enough credit to their opponents. When you are playing Abzan, everybody knows that you have access to a lot of Abzan Charms. When you have Abzan Charm in your hand, you can make lots of crazy plays, and your opponent usually doesn't call because they'll just get blown out if you have an Abzan Charm, Like, there are times where if you have a Siege Rhino and they have a Siege Rhino, if you want, you could just attack. And, of course, you must have the Abzan Charm, because if you didn't, then they could block, and then they're just in the driver's seat and you haven't accomplished anything. So you must have the Abzan Charm. And if you do have the Abzan Charm, if they block, you're going to blow them out. But because they know that you must have the Abzan Charm and it would blow them out, they don't block anyway. So even if you don't have it, you can just attack as long as you believe that you have it. Believe inside. Believe in the heart of the cards.
Well, what you're saying is make them believe that you have it, right?
They can believe whatever they want to believe, but if you believe it enough, and there's other things too. Like, you got to figure out when. See, part of it is if you have a Courser of Kruphix and your opponent has a Sylvan Caryatid, and you don't attack, then you don't attack, and then you draw a card 2 turns later. Look at their Sylvan Caryatid. Look at your card, just all in a split second, and then attack with their Courser. An awful lot of people are just going to take that too. It might not even be that important. Just a little value too. Just a tiny little, just taste it. But in that spot, because you weren't attacking beforehand, and then you did attack, and the same can be true even if you test them early. Sometimes you attack with the Courser just to see what they'll do. They block, and then you stop attacking for a while, and then you start again. And you can usually only do it 1 turn, because if you didn't do something with the Abzan charm, they're going to be suspicious. But every so often, you can just steal a couple free points of damage that way, being mindful. And that's why what I really like to do is before my turns, I always like to know, what would I do with an Abzan charm if I drew it this turn? Knowing what it is before my turn, so that I can not have to think about it after I draw. If I'm in a spot where I realize how perfect an Abzan charm would be, but it doesn't cost me very much to represent it, those are the perfect situations to do kind of semi-bluffs.
And hey, sometimes you're actually going to have the Abzan charm.
Absolutely, particularly since I never bluff. Wink, wink.
So if you're listening and you're playing in the World Championships, Patrick Chapin never bluffs. Cool. All right. I think this is a pretty good first podcast, Patrick.
Absolutely, Mike. It's been a pleasure.